When you stand at the edge of the West Mesa, the wind is the first thing that speaks to you. It comes low and distant at the beginning, almost like a whisper carried across the open land. Then it grows stronger, dragging grains of sand across your shoes, swirling dust around your ankles, tugging at your collar as if it wants to guide you somewhere. The desert here does not greet you. It tests you. It asks if you are prepared to look at what it has been hiding. I am Miller Files, and this is the beginning of a case that has haunted me since the first time I laid eyes on the barren stretch of land where 11 women waited years to be found. This is not a story about a single crime scene. It is a story about a city that looked straight into the darkness and did not see the monster until he had already buried his secrets beneath the sand. The day that everything began was February 2nd, 2009. A woman walked her dog across a patch of dusty terrain on the outskirts of Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was late afternoon, when the sun starts to lower itself behind the horizon and shadows become long and thin like stretched black ribbons. Her dog stopped, sniffed the ground, and began pawing at something that glinted faintly under the sunlight. She bent down, brushed away some dirt, and saw a small white shape emerging from the earth. At first, she thought it might be a bone from a coyote or a stray dog. But the shape was too round, too smooth, too unmistakably human. Most crimes begin with fear or anger or impulse. This one began with erosion. A storm had passed through days earlier, carving away just enough topsoil to let a fragment of the truth rise up again. One tiny piece was all it took. When police arrived, they secured the area, unaware that they were standing on top of a massive, silent graveyard. They began to dig, and the desert finally spoke the only language it had left: bones. I remember stepping onto that land months later, after the media storm had calmed and the crowds had disappeared. The earth had been dug and redrawn so many times that the ground looked scarred. The marks left behind were pale reminders of the bodies that had been taken out one by one. Even without the remains, the silence there felt different, heavy, like the land itself was exhaling after holding something in for too long. The 11 victims discovered on West Mesa lived lives that were complicated, difficult, and often invisible to the society around them. Many battled addiction. Many worked on the streets. Many slipped through cracks in a system that was never designed to catch people like them. They are often called high-risk lifestyle, high-risk behavior, high-risk population. But when I look at their photos, their ages, their faces, I see risk only in one direction. They were at risk of being targeted by someone who knew they could disappear without raising alarms. In every investigation, there is a moment when something inside you clicks. You sense a pattern forming even before the evidence confirms it. For me, that moment arrived when I first read that the victims were found in a nearly perfect line, spaced in similar distances from each other, buried at similar depths, lying almost parallel, as though guided by an internal blueprint the killer carried inside his mind. This was not the work of a man who panicked. This was the work of someone who planned, someone who returned to the same place over and over with confidence and familiarity. To carry a body in the trunk of a car or the back of a truck, to park it in the darkness where no one watched, to dig a deep enough hole to keep secrets for years, to come back again and again, as though the desert belonged to him. Whoever he was, he understood the land intimately. He knew which parts of the soil would remain stable, which areas would shift and erode, which paths led in and out of the mesa without drawing attention. Most importantly, he knew that no one was watching. The West Mesa in the early 2000s was not the busy stretch it is now. There were no sprawling subdivisions, no lights, no pavement, no cameras. Only a quiet stretch of desert with endless room to hide a nightmare. The women who vanished did not vanish all at once. It was gradual. A missing person here in 2001, another in 2002, then a sudden gap, then two more. No one ever connected them, because no one ever saw the bodies. The desert held everything tight and quiet. Each disappearance remained its own separate tragedy, but the killer knew they belonged together. He made sure of that. When crime scene investigators unearthed the 11th victim, the police realized they were no longer dealing with isolated cases. They were staring into the work of one predator, a single person who killed over the course of 4 years, then stopped, or changed, or ceased to exist. In Episode 1, I want to take you through the sensations and the truths that first formed the backbone of this case. I want you to feel the heat of the sun on the sand, the wide open space that let a killer walk in plain sight. I want you to understand how a city can be so alive on one side of the highway and so deadly on the other. When I first walked the area, the sky was a strange kind of blue, almost metallic, like the color of an old camera lens. The ground was cracked from the dryness. Small rocks crunched under my boots with every step. I crouched near one of the excavated sites, ran my fingers through the dust, and imagined the killer standing in that same spot years earlier. How long did he stand here after the burial? Did he linger? Did he breathe heavily from the effort? Did he look at the horizon to ensure no headlights were approaching? Did he whisper anything to the broken ground before leaving? A man who buries a body carefully is a man who has already convinced himself he will never be caught. And perhaps he believed that because he knew his victims would not be searched for with the same urgency as others. And historically, tragically, he was right. Every victim he chose lived on the margins. These were women whose disappearances were often reported late or lacked detailed follow-up. Many did not have stable housing. Many did not have people advocating for them. A predator studies these things. A predator makes calculations. The killer did not pick his victims at random. He selected them from a population that society looks away from. If you kill someone who lives in the shadows, you can hide their body in the dark and trust that no one will bring a flashlight soon enough. But the truth is that monsters are not as invincible as they think. Time is their only ally until the earth shifts or the weather changes, or a dog scratches the wrong piece of dirt. And time, even for predators, eventually runs out. The question that has haunted investigators, journalists, and families since 2009 is simple. Why did he stop? Serial offenders rarely stop without a reason. Something significant happens. They die. They are imprisoned on unrelated charges. They move away. They change their behavior pattern, or they find new methods that are harder to detect. We do not know which one happened here, but we know that after 2005, the disappearances connected to this case abruptly ended, and somewhere between the years when the killer walked the mesa and the day the bones surfaced, the world had changed enough that he no longer returned. Tonight, as we close Episode 1 of this documentary, I want to leave you with the image that has stayed with me since the very first day. The West Mesa at sunset, the sky turning orange and violet, the wind brushing over the ground as if sweeping the last traces of memory. And beneath that calm surface, the silent weight of 11 lives that waited years for someone to notice them again. This is where the story begins. This is where the desert finally spoke. And in episode 2, we will listen even more closely to what it said. I am Miller Files. Join me as we continue down this long, unforgiving road. When a killer chooses victims carefully, the story does not begin with death. It begins with disappearance. A moment when someone is seen for the last time, a moment that passes quietly unnoticed, without the drama that crime scenes later demand. In the West Mesa case, the disappearances happened slowly, almost invisibly, like the desert wind brushing away a trail grain by grain until nothing remains. Welcome to episode 2. I am Miller Files. And tonight, we walk into the years that the city forgot. The years when women vanished one by one, when families begged for answers, when police reports gathered dust, and when a predator moved through Albuquerque without anyone realizing they were in the presence of a man who would bury 11 bodies in the desert. The missing years begin long before anyone knew the term bone collector. They begin in 2001, a time when cell phones were not yet common among women living on the margins, when street life operated in shadows, and when every missing person file looked almost identical. Last seen near Central Avenue, last known to be in the company of individuals involved in drugs, last reported by family who had not heard from her in days, sometimes weeks. The first disappearance of what would later become the West Mesa cluster did not set off alarms. It did not make the news. It did not spark public concern. It was simply another report in a city that saw more heartbreak than its systems could keep up with. A young woman struggling with addiction, drifting between motels and acquaintances, stopped answering calls. Someone reported her missing. The file was thin. No immediate leads, no strong suspicion, no physical evidence. The desert was still silent then. Months later, another woman vanished, and then another. None of them were connected. Their families did not know each other. Their lives never crossed. The police, overwhelmed with cases that did not offer obvious criminal indicators, could only mark them as missing, note their backgrounds, and move on to the next crisis. This was not negligence. It was the nature of a system stretched beyond capacity. But to a predator, it was an opportunity wrapped neatly in bureaucracy. When I look back on those years, what chills me most is how ordinary everything seemed. Nothing dramatic, no sudden spikes in violence, no panic in the community. The killer selected his victims with the precision of someone who understood the blind spots of society. He did not attack people protected by stable homes. He did not target women who had families checking in every day. He chose women who lived in the gray zones where vanishing felt like a natural hazard, not an emergency. Imagine walking down a street at night, the neon lights flickering over weathered storefronts, the hum of distant traffic blending with murmured conversations. Somewhere in that environment he watched, he studied faces, he memorized routines, he learned who walked alone and who no longer had a safety net. To hunt effectively, a predator first becomes invisible, and in those years he was invisible to everyone except the women he approached. Some families reported their daughters missing within days. Others waited, hoping their loved ones would return as they often did after long absences. Some were too afraid to call the police. Some did not know where to begin. When investigators later looked back at the timeline, they discovered a chilling pattern. The killer struck in cycles, always spacing the disappearances far enough apart to avoid suspicion, always choosing women with similar vulnerabilities, always leaving no trace behind. One victim was last seen entering a vehicle near Central and Wyoming. She was nervous that night, according to a friend who later recalled the moment. Another woman was reported missing after she failed to show up at a shelter where she sometimes stayed. Another vanished after being dropped off at a convenience store she frequented. Nobody saw what happened after those final sightings. Nobody knew that all roads led not to their expected destinations, but to the same silent stretch of desert waiting on the West Mesa. In cases like these, one question always emerges. Did the victims know their killer? Were they lured by trust or cornered by force? When I study the West Mesa investigation files, one truth becomes clear. The killer did not need to overpower his victims violently. He needed only to offer something they sought: a ride, a promise, a moment of false safety. In worlds filled with instability, even a stranger's car can look like refuge for a few minutes. But that brief sanctuary became the final thing they ever entered. The missing years were not just about the women who disappeared. They were also about the city around them, a place that lived its daily life unaware that a predator walked among them. The Albuquerque of the early 2000s was a mixture of beauty and struggle. There were quiet suburbs, thriving neighborhoods, and sunsets that painted the sky in colors that seemed almost unreal. But only a few miles away, there were motels where people lived week to week, alleys where deals were made, corners where the night swallowed the vulnerable whole. To understand how the killer operated, you must understand the geography of the city. There was a corridor along Central Avenue known for prostitution. Women walked the sidewalks at night, hoping for clients, watching for danger, navigating a precarious existence. Dealers patrolled the same areas, exploiting desperation. Police regularly made sweeps, arrests, and warnings, but the cycle always repeated. It was here, amid the flickering lights and unpredictable dangers, that the killer found much of his pool of victims. The women did not know they were being hunted by someone far more dangerous than the nightly threats they already faced. Their killer blended into the background. He drove roads familiar to them. He offered rides that did not raise suspicion. He chose moments when they were alone and vulnerable. And he did something few killers managed to do. He left behind no witnesses, no injuries that could reveal a pattern, no surviving victims who could describe him. A serial predator who leaves no trace is nearly unheard of. Most slip up, they rush, they panic, they talk. This one did not. He operated with discipline, planning, and emotional detachment. Trauma does not seem to have driven him. Rage did not appear in the burial patterns. These were not impulsive acts. They were methodical extractions. The missing years stretched into 2004 and 2005, the final known years of disappearance. These later cases had one thing in common with the earlier ones: the absence of evidence. But by then, something else was happening in Albuquerque: construction, development. New neighborhoods were being planned on the very mesas that held the bodies. It is strange to think about how close the killer came to being discovered earlier. Heavy machinery began grading the land in 2006. Developers prepared to build homes. The earth was shifting. The killer could no longer rely on the land to hide his work. Perhaps this alone explains why he stopped. He did not need to be caught to know the risk had changed. The desert had protected him for years, but progress was coming. When police assembled the timeline years later, they were struck by the silence between disappearances. The killer did not hunt constantly. He hunted when circumstances were right. It was as if he had another life entirely, a life that kept him occupied until the moments when his desire to kill reemerged. Serial killers who maintain consistency over several years without dramatic escalation are rare. It suggests he had structure outside his crimes. Perhaps work, perhaps relationships, perhaps a routine that grounded him enough to avoid suspicion. In Episode 2, we begin to understand something essential. This was not just a killer of opportunity. This was someone who studied patterns, controlled impulses, and utilized the city like a map. He knew streets where people vanished quietly. He knew motels where tenants changed weekly. He knew which neighborhoods ignored screams and which ones called the police. He knew when the city clock shifted into darkness, and he moved like a shadow between those hours. The missing years were not just the years the victims disappeared. They were the years the killer perfected his method. Years when every disappearance taught him something new. Years when he learned how fast decomposition worked in the desert. Years when he learned how deep to dig. Years when he learned what police paid attention to and what they overlooked. But all hunters eventually face something they cannot control. For the bone collector, it was the unplanned erosion that revealed a bone in 2009. If the storm had come a week later, or if the woman had walked her dog on a different trail, perhaps the bodies would still be underground. Perhaps the killer would still be nameless. Perhaps he is still alive somewhere. Hearing these stories on the news, calm in the knowledge that no one ever saw his face. As Episode 2 comes to a close, remember this: every disappearance is a story interrupted. Every missing woman had a reason she walked where she walked, met who she met, lived how she lived. They were not statistics. They were not a pattern. They were daughters, sisters, friends, mothers. Some had dreams that stretched beyond the streets. Some were fighting battles no one understood. Some were trying to restart their lives. Their killer stole more than their bodies. He stole their second chances. In Episode 3, we step deeper into the psychology of the predator. We analyze how a man becomes a ghost in his own city and why he chose West Mesa not only as a burial site, but as a personal landscape of control and ritual. I am Miller Files, and we are only beginning to understand the mind of the bone collector. There is a moment in every investigation when the physical evidence stops speaking and something else must take over. You stand at the edge of the known world, staring into the behavior that lies beneath it. Bones can tell us how someone died. The soil can tell us where they were buried, and timelines can tell us when they vanished. But only psychology can tell us who the killer truly was. Welcome to Episode 3. I am Miller Files, and tonight we step into the shadows cast by the bone collector. To understand him, we must abandon the comfort of ordinary explanations and allow ourselves to think like the one who walked the desert carrying bodies in the dead of night. When I examine this case, what strikes me first is not cruelty, but control. Cruelty is chaotic. Cruelty leaves marks, shouts, and jagged edges. This killer had none of that. His violence hid beneath precision. His power emerged through planning. He killed as though he were fulfilling a task he had assigned to himself, structured and repetitive, almost ritualistic, but without ceremony. This type of killer belongs to a rare category, not driven by rage, not driven by panic, not driven by symbolism or delusion. Instead, driven by an internal coldness, a hollow place where empathy used to live. He did not want spectacle. He did not want infamy. He wanted control over bodies and silence over memory. What kind of person lives that way? What kind of person kills that way? When the FBI studied the West Mesa case, they produced a behavioral profile suggesting that the killer was organized, familiar with the area, and experienced enough with the victim's lifestyle that he could approach them without resistance. But this is a surface-level description. Tonight, we go deeper. to move unnoticed among those who are vulnerable. The killer must have been someone who did not appear threatening at first glance, a man whose presence blended into the environment, someone who could pull up to a sidewalk on Central Avenue and not raise alarm, someone who knew how to speak calmly, how to offer reassurance, how to suggest trust. Predators who hunt in the open cannot rely on brute force alone. They rely on social camouflage. I have spent years studying offenders like this. They do not erupt like volcanoes. They erode like sand, slowly, quietly, wearing away the boundaries inside themselves until the space where morality should be becomes an open desert. One image that stays with me is the act of burial, not the violence before it, not the abduction, not the final moments of the victims, but the burial itself. Imagine a man alone on the mesa at night, the wind scraping at his jacket, the headlights of passing cars miles away. He digs, the shovel hits dry earth, cracking through the crust layer. He lifts the soil, scoops it aside, checks the depth, then digs again. It takes time, it takes strength, it takes commitment. Most killers want to escape the crime scene as quickly as possible. This man created the scene himself. He lingered there long enough to complete the task with disturbing consistency. The burial pattern shows deliberation, parallel placement, similar spacing, similar depth. These were not improvisations. These were decisions made by someone who found safety in structure. Structure is the hallmark of a killer who compartmentalizes his life. There is the part of him the world sees, the neighbor, the coworker, the man who buys groceries and nods politely in stores. And then there is the other part, the nocturnal figure who drives into the darkness with a body in the trunk and a plan that has worked before. There is often a misconception that killers who target sex workers or drug-dependent individuals choose them because of hatred or disgust. But that does not appear true here. The bone collector did not demonstrate emotional signatures in his burial. He did not mutilate. He did not stage his victims. He did not leave messages. Such killers kill for gratification rooted not in emotion, but in domination. It is not about passion. It is about power over a moment. To him, these women were not symbols. They were vulnerabilities, opportunities, people whose absence would not generate enough noise to bring the police quickly. And in that calculation lies the darkest truth of the case. Society's neglect became his weapon. Another characteristic stands out: longevity. Most killers who commit multiple murders either escalate or unravel. They grow sloppy. They take risks. They draw attention. But in this case, the killer remained consistent for years, then stopped. No escalation, no unraveling. He ended not from inner collapse, but from external pressure. Construction, land development. The sudden threat that the mesa would no longer be his sanctuary. To stop killing voluntarily is extremely rare among serial offenders. It suggests either that something significant changed in his life or that he no longer needed what killing provided. Perhaps he entered a relationship. Perhaps he moved away. Perhaps he was arrested on an unrelated charge. Perhaps he died. The truth is buried as deeply as his victims were. What fascinates me most is the psychological endurance required to maintain normalcy while committing acts like these. Most serial killers experience intrusive fantasies that consume their daily lives. They lose jobs, they isolate, they spiral. But not this man. He functioned. He adapted. He waited years between crimes without losing his structure. That level of emotional detachment is not learned. It is either born or cultivated over a lifetime. What did he look like? Was he tall or short? Did he speak softly? Did he wear work boots? Did he sweat easily? Did he smile often? These questions haunt the mind because there is no way to answer them. But based on behavioral parallels from similar offenders, we can infer that he likely lived near Albuquerque for a long time, that he knew the city's darker corners intimately, and that he had a vehicle capable of carrying bodies discreetly, perhaps a truck, perhaps an SUV, something unremarkable but spacious. Killers who bury their victims tend to be patient, meticulous, and physically strong. They often come from backgrounds in labor, intensive work, construction, landscaping, or jobs that require digging or earth moving. The West Mesa environment demands knowledge of soil density, erosion patterns, and discrete access points. This man knew those things instinctively or professionally. The women who entered his vehicle probably sensed none of this. To them, he was just another man driving by, offering something small. A ride, a conversation, a chance. They could not know that he had already chosen a grave for them. The psychology of the bone collector is not built on insanity. It is built on invisibility. He made himself forgettable. He hid behind the ordinariness of his life. That is why no witnesses came forward. That is why no one remembered him. As we continue the investigation in this episode, there is another key psychological element to understand: ritual through repetition. Even though there was no symbolic ritual, the act of burying in straight lines with equal spacing shows internal order. Humans crave patterns, even killers, especially killers. The burial ground on West Mesa was his map of dominance. He returned to the same place because the place itself became part of his identity. He owned it in the way predators own territories in the wild. His return marked familiarity, comfort, control. When I picture him walking back to his vehicle after each burial, brushing dust from his hands, checking the area one last time, I imagine the silence in his mind. No guilt, no turmoil, just completion. A man like that does not kill out of anger. Anger leaves noise. This man left only silence. To become someone capable of that level of emotional emptiness, something must have eroded inside him long before the first murder. Maybe childhood trauma, maybe social alienation, maybe early experiences of domination. The exact origin of his pathology may never be known, but his behavior reflects someone who learned early in life that human beings can be reduced to objects. And to him, the women he murdered were exactly that: objects to move, hide, and discard. Their pain meant nothing. Their absence meant nothing. Only his schedule mattered. Only his ritual mattered. Only his control mattered. As episode 3 draws to a close, we are left with a chilling realization. The bone collector was not a creature of passion or chaos. He was a creature of structure, a man who found sanctuary in the desert and who used that sanctuary to erase lives with terrifying efficiency. He is a man we still do not know, a man who may still be alive, a man who may walk past you in a store, unnoticed, unremarked, unseen. That is his power, and that is the reason this case remains one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. In episode 4, we move from psychology to evidence. We examine the suspects, the clues, and the investigative dead ends that still frustrate detectives today. I am Miller Files, and the road into the desert is darker than ever. When a case holds its silence too long, suspicion begins to grow like weeds. It spreads into every corner of the investigation, into every name whispered by neighbors, into every man who lived near the mesa during those missing years. And eventually, The weight of the desert falls upon three shadows. Three men whose lives intersected with violence, geography, or timing in ways that echoed the methods of the Bone Collector. Welcome to Episode 4. I am Miller Files, and tonight we explore the suspects who emerged from beneath the dust of West Mesa. Each man carried his own darkness. Each man lived close to the nightmare, and each man could have been the ghost we now call the Bone Collector. The first name is the one that still lingers most clearly in the minds of investigators: Lorenzo Montoya. His house sat less than 3 miles from where the bodies were buried. That distance alone would not condemn a man, but his history painted a deeper shadow. For years, Montoya had been known to solicit sex workers. He had been accused of kidnapping. He had assaulted women before. When you read the old police reports, you feel a chill, not because of the specific charges, but because of how familiar the patterns sound: control, coercion, the belief that certain women could be harmed without consequence. Montoya moved through the same streets as the victims during the exact years they were disappearing. He fit into the map of the city like a puzzle piece waiting for confirmation. But the most damning detail didn't come from a file. It came from the night he died. In 2006, a woman ran from Montoya's home, screaming for help. She was half-dressed, bruised, disoriented. Behind her came Montoya, dragging her by the arm, trying to pull her back inside. A relative of the woman saw the struggle and fired a gun. Montoya fell to the ground, dead within seconds. And just like that, one of Albuquerque's most dangerous men left the world before anyone knew they might need him alive. Had he not died that night, would the murders have continued? Did the killing stop because he was gone, or did they stop for reasons far more complex? Investigators searched Montoya's property. They found restraints. They found traces of violence. They found evidence that he had used his home as a trap long before the night he died. But they did not find anything linking him directly to the West Mesa burials. No trophies, no personal belongings of the victims, no photographs, no maps, nothing. The evidence was suggestive, but not conclusive. Enough to make him a prime suspect, not enough to close the case. The second man in this triad of shadows is Joseph Blee. If Montoya was known for violence against sex workers, Blee was known for something more insidious. He had been labeled the mid-school rapist, a predator who attacked women and teenage girls over many years. His crimes were opportunistic, calculated, and often committed in areas not far from where several victims of the West Mesa case were last seen. Blee was the type of man who moved silently through neighborhoods, studying women with a detached patience that no one noticed until it was far too late. He had a history of stalking, a history of assault, a history that mirrored predators capable of escalating into serial homicide. During a search of his home, police found jewelry that did not belong to his family. They found clothing that investigators believed could have belonged to missing women. They found hints of a double life that had gone undetected for decades. But again, the case did not yield what investigators truly needed. No DNA tie into the West Mesa remains, no definitive connection to the burial site. Only circumstantial shadows. If Montoya was the monster next door, Blee was the phantom in the alleyway. Both men fit parts of the profile. Both lived near the danger zone. Both preyed on women who fit the victim demographic. But neither man could be anchored firmly to the graves in the desert. The third shadow is more complex and far more difficult to isolate. It is not a single man, but a possibility, a theory that the murders could have been the work of someone involved in drug trafficking or organized crime. Sex trafficking networks operated in Albuquerque during the early 2000s. Women on the margins were often coerced into these underground systems, and cartels are known for disposing of bodies in remote areas. At first, it seemed plausible, but as investigators studied the burial patterns, the theory cracked. Organized crime does not bury victims in neat lines, spaced with mathematical precision. Groups do not dig identical graves over the course of years in the same location. They bury in haste, not in ritual. They hide quickly, not consistently. They kill many, not selectively. And they do not return to the same burial ground again and again. That type of behavior belongs to an individual, not a cartel. Still, the possibility could not fully be eliminated. The border regions of the Southwest often blur lines between individual predators and organized networks. But the precision of the burials continued to point toward one man alone, moving through the city with knowledge and confidence that no group would ever need. The frustrating truth is that each suspect felt like a reflection of the bone collector, but none of them were perfect mirrors. Montoya had the violence, the opportunity, the proximity. Blee had the predatory psychology and the years of stalking behavior. The cartel theory had the resources and the access to victims. But the desert held its silence, refusing to name the man who walked across it with a body in his arms. What makes the case even more agonizing is how close investigators came to answers several times. In 2010, a break seemed imminent. A woman claimed she had escaped from a man who restrained her in a rural area outside Albuquerque. She said he talked about taking her to the desert. She described his truck, his demeanor, his voice that wavered between calmness and madness. But no remains were found in the area she described. No matching suspect emerged. The lead dissolved like dust in the wind. Another break came when a convicted killer from Colorado confessed that he had traveled through New Mexico during the early 2000s. Investigators considered him seriously. His victims resembled the West Mesa victims. His methods were similar, but his timeline wavered. His story bent under scrutiny. His confession turned out to be nothing more than the fantasy of a man seeking attention. Then there was the moment. Police thought they had finally found hard evidence. A photo album discovered by a woman who bought a storage unit at auction. Inside the album were hundreds of pictures of women, many of them resembling the West Mesa victims. Some photos were candid street shots. Some were posed. Some were taken in motels. The internet erupted with speculation, but after exhaustive analysis, the women in the album were eventually identified. None were victims of the bone collector. Another dead end, another hope extinguished. Every suspect leaves a trail, but in this case, the trails loop back into the sand. The killer, whoever he was, built his identity on the absence of evidence. He lived unnoticed, hunted unnoticed, and disappeared unnoticed. He had no signature, no chaos, only silence and order. And perhaps the most haunting question of all is this: did he watch the investigation unfold? Did he sit in a living room somewhere in New Mexico, watching the news as police unearthed the remains he once buried with such care? Did he see the aerial footage of the excavation and feel triumph, or fear, or nothing at all? We cannot know. That is the nature of phantoms. As Episode 4 draws to its close, we stand among the shadows of three suspects. None fully illuminated, none fully eliminated. The truth may be buried not only in the desert, but in the lives of men who lived and died without ever being linked to the crimes that hover over West Mesa like a permanent dust cloud. In Episode 5, the final chapter, we confront the unresolved questions. We explore why the case remains unsolved, what new technology might reveal, and whether the bone collector could still be alive today. I am Miller Files, and the desert is still not done speaking. There are cases that end with justice. There are cases that end with answers. And then there are cases that end with silence, a silence so deep and so persistent that it becomes part of the land itself. Tonight, we reach the final chapter of the West Mesa investigation, not because the mystery has been solved, but because the story has reached the edge of what we can know. Beyond this point lies only speculation, shadows, and the possibility that the bone collector still walks somewhere beneath the same sky that witnessed his crimes. I am Miller Files, and this is Episode 5, The Desert's Last Secret. When detectives gathered around the excavation site in 2009, they believed that time had ended the killer's reign. They believed that the sand had held the evidence long enough for truth to surface. But time, as it turns out, was not the enemy of the killer. It was his accomplice. The years buried crucial details. Weather erased forensic clues. Decomposition swallowed the violence. The desert itself became a co-conspirator, guarding the secret of how these women died, who put them there, and what moments preceded their final breath. Why has this case never been solved? The reasons stretch far beyond one man's ability to evade capture. They lie inside the perfect storm of forensic limitations, social neglect, geographic vastness, and the passage of nearly a decade before the bodies were discovered. Many of the victims were last seen years before they were found. Their remains were skeletonized, stripped of nearly all trace evidence. No ligature marks could survive. No DNA from an attacker remained. No clothing preserved forensic signatures. Their bones carried silence, not answers. Most homicides rely on immediate evidence, blood, fingerprints, hair, fibers, digital footprints, eyewitness testimonies. The West Mesa case had none of these. It was a puzzle missing, not just a few pieces, but nearly all of them. And by the time the remains were discovered, the clock on justice had already run out. Another reason for the case's stagnation lies not beneath the sand, but within society itself. These women were vulnerable, living on the margins where violence often goes unnoticed. Their disappearances were not treated with urgency. Reports were filed late. Leads were thin. The lack of early investigation meant that opportunities to connect their vanishings were lost. A killer thrives when no one is watching, and for those years, no one was. But the most haunting question is the one that lingers: is the bone collector still alive? If the killings stopped because he died, then the case is nothing more than a ghost forever sealed beneath the mesa. But if he stopped because the world around him changed, that means he could still be out there. Maybe older, maybe slower, maybe transformed into a man who watches the world from a distance but still carries the memory of what he buried. Serial killers rarely retire. They are not driven by phases or convenience. They are driven by internal compulsion. For one to stop, something must interfere: incarceration, death, relocation, illness, or a drastic shift in life circumstances. If Montoya was the killer, then his death explains the halt. If Blee was the killer, then his imprisonment explains the silence. But if neither man was the bone collector, then the most unsettling possibility remains. He simply walked away. The West Mesa killer could have started a new life in another state. He could have blended into a new community, taken a job, raised a family, attended barbecues, waved at neighbors. He could have passed you in a grocery store, stood behind you in line, bought coffee at the same place every morning. He could be living quietly, carrying a secret so heavy that only the desert ever heard it. Or maybe he watches the news every year on February 2nd, remembering the moment a bone breached the earth and ended his sanctuary. Maybe he keeps a box hidden somewhere, an item, a memory, something that ties him to the women he buried. Or maybe he burned everything the moment he sensed danger. Men like him do not leave sentimental traces. They leave voids. There is a theory among some investigators that the killer may have returned to the burial site after his crimes, not to mourn, not to reflect, but to check, to stand over the land that safeguarded his sins and reassure himself that the earth still held them tight. I have walked that land myself, and I can imagine him there, a lone figure against the horizon, the wind pulling at his clothes, his eyes fixed on the ground beneath his feet, checking, waiting, trusting the desert. But the desert, like all accomplices, eventually betrays. In 2009, erosion gave up its secret. A storm shifted the sand. A bone surfaced, and the world woke up. The killer's ritual was laid bare beneath the sky. His order, his precision, his territory, but not his name. How many more bodies might be buried out there? That question hovers like a storm that refuses to break. The excavation site covers only a portion of the mesa. There are acres of untouched land, places where the earth has never been scanned, where storms have not yet risen, where secrets remain undisturbed. Search teams conducted aerial scans and ground-penetrating radar sweeps. But the mesa is large and shifting. Soil density changes, sand shifts. Bones move. The desert does not surrender easily. It guards its dead until the moment it decides not to. There are families who still wonder if their missing daughters may lie somewhere beneath that expanse. Mothers who have aged years beyond their grief. Sisters who can only visit a patch of land rather than a grave. Children who grew up without knowing what happened to the woman who brought them into the world. For these families, closure is a luxury. Justice is a fantasy. The truth is a horizon they may never reach. As we come to the end of this series, I find myself returning again and again to the same question. What does it mean to tell a story that has no ending? What does it mean to walk through a case where the killer lives only in theory, a ghost constructed from patterns and absence? The West Mesa Bone Collector is not just an individual. He is a manifestation of everything that can go wrong in a society: vulnerable victims, limited resources, compromised investigations, environmental decay, human silence. But he also represents something else: the persistence of mystery, the limits of justice, the truth that evil does not always leave a trail. Tonight, as the final words of this investigation settle into the air, I want you to imagine the mesa at night. No excavation lights, no police tape, only the desert. The same desert that hid the bodies, the same desert that exposed them. A quiet black horizon stretching endlessly outward. Somewhere in that silence lies the answer to who the bone collector was. Maybe one day the desert will speak again. Maybe erosion will lift another truth to the surface. Or maybe this is a story that ends the same way it began, with a woman walking her dog, with the earth shifting, with a small white bone rising to the light. This is the West Mesa Bone Collector. I am Miller Files, and this investigation will haunt me for the rest of my life.